All right, this is Babu here. Just wanted to, before I get started on this, I just want to give you a little bit of some background over what we're going to be doing. Since we left for spring break, you've already heard the announcement that all classes from now on are going to be online. So what I want to do in order to finish up this class is to keep it as close to the classes you've been having up till this point. So I want uh, it to work like you've been doing before, which is where you'll have the review sheets, you'll look up the terms in the book, and you'll have lectures that you'll be taking notes over. In class, what I would do is I would have talk with the PowerPoint projection going on the screen behind me. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just recording a lecture over the pictures. And so you'll be looking at that from here on in. Uh, I'm putting this up for all my 1301 classes. If you're in the late start class, this is the starting point for your second exam. This is the first topic on your exam 2 review sheet. If you're on my three classes that already started, the early start classes, my three sections, you've already covered this topic. Uh, we covered it in the week before spring break. However, I figured you've got a audio only recording of this up, but I figured it couldn't hurt if you had this also up here if you look through your notes and it didn't make any sense. So if you're comfortable with the notes you already got, you don't have to listen to this anymore. If, however, you don't, you can go through and scan through it again. All right. So anyway, as to how your exams are going to work from here on in, I'll let you know on that on a future recording, and I'll also give you that through an email message. That is, I'm still trying to work out the logistics of that, which is how can I work an exam through D2L that will essentially work because in the world of cell phones, giving people an unproctored exam where I have basically terms to identify where you have a term and you fill in a definition is something that just doesn't work. So I'm trying to figure out a substitute for that for your exams. I'll finish that up in the next couple of weeks, and I'll have that up there before the start date on April the 13th. By the way, nothing in this class is going to be due before April the 13th. I know for my late start class, you all had a paper that was supposed to be due, I think, on the 27th. I'm not going to give you a due date on that until I'm sure the April 13th start date, and then I'll let you know when that is going to be coming in. Also, for all of my sections, uh, the dates for the exams, the due dates for your book assignments, I will revise as we get closer to the start date. Anyway, with that, let me go ahead and get with this topic. What we're going to be covering in your class today is why was there an American Revolution? And I put over on your D2L a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And if you want to pause this for a second and keep that in front of you, it's good to look at that while we're going on because it makes a lot of things make more sense. That is, the Declaration of Independence was put forward by a group called the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress in July of 1776 decided that they were going to leave the United Kingdom and become an independent nation. You read that this is not a decision they took lightly. That is, the early part, the first couple of paragraphs of that were saying you need a really good reason to break up a country because you get all kinds of chaos and disorder involved. So if the United States wanted to be an independent nation, they should give a reason for it. So what follows after those first couple of paragraphs is a list of 26 reasons, grievances they had with the British government that they said justified a war, justified them breaking away from the government of Britain and starting their own nation. And if you read through those 26 grievances, it's pretty significant what's not in them, right? That is, at some point, go through the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. as the Bill of Rights lists the basic rights that an American citizen considers to be his rights. The First Amendment gives the basic ones: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. If you go through the 26 grievances that the Continental Congress listed, specifically that Thomas Jefferson listed, he was the principal writer, note that none of them were in there. That is, none of the 26 mentioned freedom of speech. They were not complaining that the British government was trying to take it away from them or was preventing them from having it. None of them were referring to freedom of the press. There were no complaints over there that the British were shutting down newspapers or anything like that. There were not complaints that the British were preventing Americans from assembling peaceably. There was no complaints over there that the British government wasn't allowing Americans to petition the Parliament for grievances. Right? There is no reference at all in those 26 grievances to religion. That is, there's nothing in there that said that the British government was interfering with the free practice of religion in America. Actually, in Britain, they handle religion the same way they did in the American colonies. That is, typically the governments of the colonies would have an established church. That is, one official church that would be the church of the colony. But all that meant was that if you lived in the colony, you had to pay taxes to those churches. They called that a tithe. As long as you paid your tithe, you could practice any religion you wanted. That was the same way England worked. In England, the official church was the Church of England. As long as you paid a tithe to the Church of England, though, you could do whatever you wanted. There were plenty of other churches. They called them dissenting religions. In the typical American colony, it worked the same way. Just the only difference would be what church was the established church. Massachusetts, it was the Puritan Church. Virginia, it would be the Church of England. Places like Maryland, they didn't have an established church. But the basic freedoms that you would consider to be the rights of a person are not really mentioned here. The only one that was mentioned was the right to a trial by jury, and that was a special case we'll talk about in a second. So the American Revolution was not fought for freedom in the way that you define individual freedom in the Bill of Rights. So why was it fought? Well, lots of countries are fight for their independence because of economic hardships. That is, there's starvation in the land. The economy is bad. You don't see any mention of that either. That is, there's no mention in the Declaration of Independence that Americans have it hard, that people are going hungry, that there's starvation in the country, that there's hunger in the streets. Right? Actually, the American economy at this time was going very well. How you measure an economy is through a statistic called the gross national product or gross domestic product today. And how you can compare one country to another is by dividing that by the population. That's called gross domestic product per capita. The highest gross domestic product per capita in the world in 1775 was Britain. Number two were the American colonies of Britain. Mexico would not have a GNP per capita as high as America did in 1775 until 1940. India wouldn't have one as high as that until 1976. Right? So the American colonists were economically pretty well off. And actually, if you were an average person in America, your life was better than an average person in England. Because in England, wealth was not evenly distributed. Wealthy people had a lot of wealth, but the average working person lived hand to mouth. 2/3 of the country was poor. In America, though, the typical white person was a small farmer who owned his own land. They were middle class by the standards of that world. They had lives that were pretty comfortable. They owned their own land. They could produce what they needed to survive off of them. So if you're an American, economically, your life was good when the revolution started. And actually, your economy depended on England because the way they brought wealth into the country was primarily through three things. If you're in a southern colony, you would start up a plantation and you would grow something like indigo or tobacco and sell. That brought wealth into the country. Your biggest market was England because under the mercantilist regulations, you had exclusive access to British markets. The second way to get rich in America was to own a ship and carry cargoes. That's how New England did it. We covered that when we talked about the Puritans. The cargoes you carried were British cargoes because under the English navigation laws, People in the merchants in the empire were required to use ships from the empire to carry their cargoes. Right. So by 1770, 2/3 of all of Britain's cargoes were carried by American ships. The third way to get rich was you could own a big farm or fishing operation that produced food. You would then take that food and you would sell it in the Caribbean to the slave colonies to feed the slaves. And your biggest market were the British colonies, particularly Jamaica, right? Because under the British mercantilist regulations, you had exclusive access to them. So not only was the British Empire the biggest source of wealth in the United States prior to the Revolution, it would all be taken away if America became independent. Because if America was independent, it was just another foreign nation. The British mercantilist regulations would shut down access to America. Right? So, for any practical reason you would look at, okay, kind of the definitions of freedom we have, okay, about money, they would all seem to go point in the same direction. Stick with England, you got it pretty good. Right? So, if that's the case, why did the American colonists decide to take the huge risk of starting a war with the most powerful nation in the world to become independent? Right? And that's where we're going to look at for the rest of your class today. And let's start by re-looking at the Declaration of Independence. We've gone over what was not in there, so now let's look over what was. Of the 26 grievances that are listed, half of them were short-term reasons. That is, the British, when the revolutionary crisis started, that is, the protests against British rule started in 1763, carried out a number of actions to try to keep control. And half of the grievances listed in the revolution were just about them, okay, about what the British government was doing between 1763 and 1775. If you look at these a little bit closer and compare them to your textbook, you'll find that a lot of these are mentioned in the textbook. Some of them are pretty famous, such as the Boston Massacre or the Quebec Act, right? And in the case of trial by jury, the main thing that we talked about a specific right that was being taken away. Trial by jury was taken away because only in the specific case of protesters against British rule. They thought that colonial juries would just let them off, so they brought them back to England to put on trial. So you see both of those complained about here. So none of these, though, explain why the revolution was going on. They would explain how, when the Americans were protesting against England, why they would get madder. But they don't explain why they were mad in the first place. That was what was in the long run leading the Americans to want to protest against British rule in the first place. Okay, let this get out of hand. So let's look at those. The Declaration of Independence had 5 grievances that I categorize under failures of British administration. That is, it wasn't what the British government was doing that made the Americans mad, it was what they weren't doing. That is, you see here, the king has refused to assent to laws necessary for the public good. He has forbidden governors from passing laws unless his assent would be obtained, okay? And he wasn't giving his permission. He has refused to pass other laws for create representative districts. Right? He has not created a law to naturalize foreigners. Right? That is, immigration was an issue in 1770 as well, though it was the other way around. They weren't complaining about too many immigrants, they were complaining about too few. The British government was making it easy for people to move into America. And he has refused to give his permission for laws to establish courts. Right? So a lot of what the Americans were mad about was because the British government wasn't functioning properly. That is, it wasn't doing things that the Americans wanted them to do. Another set of things that the Declaration of Independence was complaining about was corruption of the British government. That is, Jefferson says the king has made judges dependent on his will alone, okay, for their jobs and for their payments. And he has created a multitude of new offices, that has created a bureaucracy with a lot of people in it, and has sent swarms of bureaucrats to harass the people and take their money. So what we've seen so far, we've seen complaints about the inefficiency of the British government. We've seen complaints about the corruption of the British government. Jefferson also has a number of complaints about the military of Britain. And his primary complaint is that the military of Britain exists at all. Right? This is something that would be surprising in the America of today, because today we think of the military as a patriotic institution. But that wasn't the way that intellectuals looked at it 300 years ago. Right? And that wasn't the way that it was looked at throughout most of American history. That is, if you're around in 1760, throughout Europe, there were a bunch of people who thought that the existence of a military in peacetime was an invitation to tyranny. That is, every general wanted to be Caesar. Right? So you can see here that Jefferson was one of the people who believed that. He says complains specifically that the king is keeping an army in peacetime without consent of the legislature, that he has made this army independent of and superior to civilian government. And he's had a couple of other complaints about the military. One was that he quartered large bodies of troops among us. What that refers to is the governments of the world at this time did not really like to pay armies very much. So they didn't want to spend money in order to build them bases. So what they would do was they would uh, tell civilians to house their soldiers in their own homes. That was called quartering. So in a city like Boston, poor people would have to take a British soldier into their home. They would have to prepare them their meals, and the wife would do the laundry for the soldier for them. This really alienated a lot of people. And in the Declaration of Independence, I mean, in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it's specifically banned. The other thing, complaint about the military, is the 25th thing that was listed. Says that the king has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. What this is referring to is something called impressment. That is, at that time, a military ship was a lousy job. The pay was bad, the conditions were brutal, discipline was harsh. So sailors didn't want to work for the navies. So if you had a big navy like Britain or France, what you would do if you needed crews is oftentimes you would stop civilian ships at sea and kidnap their sailors and make them work for you. This was called impressment. Okay? The excuse you would give is that the sailors that you were kidnapping were really members of your navy, they just deserted in some port. Right? And impressment is going to be a big issue between the Americans and Europe for the next 25 years, or really for the next 50 years. That is, it's going to be an issue as lead up to the Revolution. It's going to be an issue when America becomes independent, and it's going to be a cause for something called the War of 1812, which you'll read about in your textbook. Right? So we've got the American colonists complaining about inefficiency of the British government. It isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It's complaining about corruption of the British government. It's complaining about the British government's use of the military, including having one at all. And it's complaining about trade restrictions. That is, one specific grievance was that the British government is cutting off trade with the colonies with other parts of the world. That is, Americans were supposed to trade with Britain. All their exports were supposed to go through Britain. They weren't supposed to cut their own deals with other nations. And the colonists are considering that unfair. And finally, Jefferson had a grievance about taxes. This today is the most famous line in the Declaration of Independence: taxation without representation, that the British government has imposed taxes on America without their consent. And usually, if you're a patriotic American today, if you're one of those political geeks, this is the one you harp on. But it was only one of the reasons why they were mad. And let us look into the context of why they would be mad about taxes. It wasn't because the taxes were particularly high. That is, in the American colonies, taxes were actually lower for people than they were in the British Home Islands. And Americans were notorious for avoiding taxes anyway. They were chronic tax evaders. Taxes in this context angered Jefferson in much the same way the military did. Taxes made him mad because they existed at all. And why taxes would give Americans such a problem would be for broader reasons than just the money. And we'll talk more about that later on. So, what we got so far is in the long run, you see a number of grievances leading the United States to be people, what would become the United States to be mad at the British government: inefficiency, corruption, military power, the trade restrictions the British are putting in, the taxes the British are imposing. So if you add all of that up, what do you get? Is there any common theme that ties it all together? And it turns out there is one. It is one we've covered in this class already. It is mercantilism. That is, remember when we covered mercantilism? What were the problems of mercantilism? Well, mercantilism led to a lot of corruption and self-serving within the government. This is being reflected in the Declaration of Independence. It's leading the government to become very inefficient because as the government picks winners and losers, increasingly its administration becomes arbitrary. Some things happen, some things don't. You're seeing that reflect in the revolution. You're seeing mercantilism being put into place in order to support nation states, which are centered around powerful militaries. That's being reflected in the Declaration of Independence. How did mercantilism work? Well, one of the big goals of mercantilism was to control trade in order to make sure that you limited imports and promoted export. You restricted trade, right? The colonists are seeing themselves the victims of this. And in mercantilism, you see a great deal of injustice. That is, the little people get crushed. And that's really for them what taxes were about. They saw taxes as a means of injustice, okay, more so than they saw it as an end in itself. And that is something that we're going to be building up a lot. Because if we're looking in the long run about why America is going to be mad at British rule and want out, even though life under British rule wasn't all that bad for them, the whole kind of problems of mercantilism, which we mentioned before, is one thing that is driving the Americans to resent British rule. But also, they are afraid of the future. That is, they think that things are well now, but that things will be bad in the future. This is a fear that you could see coming out of mercantilism. That is, in mercantilism, you're either one of the guys in charge, you get crushed, right? That is, injustice is a major component of it. So the American colonists are afraid of the future. That is, they develop almost a sense of paranoia that the British government is out to destroy them, that what they have will be taken away from them. So, what I want to do next is kind of build up on that. That is, why do the Americans living in a mercantilist society are going to go beyond their specific grievances for mercantilism to see mercantilism and all the actions of the British government as a plot to destroy them? We'll look at that, and then we'll look into the short-term triggers. That is, by 1763, you're going to see in America a bunch of American colonists who are going to have a deep-seated fear and suspicion of Britain. They're going to think that British rule over them is unfair and isn't even a plot to destroy them. And then after 1763, you're going to see a bunch of specific events that are going to happen that's going to trigger that fear. And then we'll go into that towards the end of this class. Right? So this mercantilist society is going to build up a fear of the injustices of the British government. They're going to be convinced that the British government is going to be a plot to destroy them. So let's look into beyond the overall problems of mercantilism, why they would believe this. And let's start by looking at the British government itself. Right? The picture you're looking at here is a man named Robert Walpole, Walpole. He's one of the terms on your list. Walpole in 1720 was essentially the head of the British government. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Okay, when last we talked about the British government, remember they had three components of their government. You had a king and you had a parliament with two houses in it. One house represented the aristocracy, the other represented the commons. The king had real power in England in the 1600s. As the king was essentially the equivalent of the American president, was commander in chief of the armed forces, had to sign off on any law before it could be imposed or before it could become legal. He was the head of the bureaucracy. But in 1714, Britain got a new king. His name was George the First. That is, the Queen of England at the time, Queen Anne, died. All of her close relatives were Catholic. So the British Parliament did not want a Catholic monarch. So they looked for her closest Protestant relative in the world. Turns out it was a guy from Germany named George. So they invited them to become King of England. So he hopped on a boat, went to England. He took one look around England, hated it, got back on his boat, and went back to Germany. Right? And so as a result, he was not going to take an active role in running England. Right? And this is really the starting point of what makes the British monarchy what it is today. That is, today, all the Queen of England does is wave at tourists. She has no real power. And the starting point on that was George the First. That is, since he did not want to be involved in running England, he essentially gave up his authority over running England. And the kings that followed him never got it back. So if George the First doesn't want to be effectively the president of England, doesn't want to have that executive authority, who's going to have it? Well, he picked a politician named Robert Walpole, and he told him to run the country while he was gone, right? And Walpole, as a result, effectively became what the British today call the prime minister. The prime minister is the king's, technically the king's representative who runs the government, right? And so Walpole was pretty much the first one. And Walpole had to run a society that was very divided. That is, at the top, when you looked at the rich guys who ran the country, who made up the parliament, they were divided between people who wanted a powerful monarchy and people who didn't want a monarchy at all. You had people who were divided over religion. You still had Puritans in the British Parliament. You had Catholics in the British Parliament. You had Church of England people in the British Parliament. So you had a bunch of British leaders who were fighting amongst themselves, and Walpole had to figure out a way how to unite them. So how he decided to do it was by spreading the money around. That is, remember, he is running a mercantilist country. So under mercantilism, the government gets to write up regulations for how the country is going to work. So the government can pick winners and losers. So Walpole told all the important people in England, if you back my play, if you do what I say, if you help me stay in charge, then you get a piece of the action. You get some valuable government contracts. You get valuable monopolies. You get valuable in government offices where you can steal a lot of money. And if you don't back my play, you don't get anything. Right? So by spreading the money around, Walpole was able to keep a divided country united. But by doing so, he made a lot of enemies. And what these enemies did was they started basically spreading conspiracy theories about him. One of the more notable of these was a group called the Radical Whigs. They're on your terms list too. The Radical Whigs were extremists who did not want a king at all. That is, in English politics at the time, a Whig was somebody who wanted the parliament to be powerful and not the king. The Radical Whigs did not want a king at all. They just wanted the parliament to run the country like it did when after the English Civil War, when Oliver Cromwell ran the country. So these Radical Whigs, to oppose Walpole, said that he was essentially a Caesar wannabe. That is, they started to spread a conspiracy story around him, that Walpole was conspiring to take over all power in the country for himself. He was using bribery and corruption in order to undermine the country. He was working his way through the government like a cancer, okay? Killing off all its free parts and replacing them with people who were loyal to him. And if he wasn't stopped, he would get to a point where he would control everything. He would get rid of the parliament. He would get rid of the king, and he would become a dictator of the country. Essentially, they said he was Palpatine from the first three horrible Star Wars movies. Right? So by the time we get into the 1720s and 30s, this story is spreading throughout England. One of the places it spread was America, because they were Americans who were members of parliament. By coincidence, these guys tended to be part of the Radical Whig faction. So they heard these stories about Robert Walpole and spread them back into America. Okay, so by the time you get to 1740, the stories about the evil Robert Walpole plotting to destroy liberty were all over the country. And then Robert Walpole lost his job. When he did, though, the stories didn't go away. They just kind of changed. Instead of being Robert Walpole is undermining the liberty of the people and is plotting to destroy them and enslave them, it became the government itself is plotting to do that. And this was something that was believable in a country that looks at a mercantilist government as corrupt, ineffective, and backed up by military power. Right? So by the time you're getting to the 1740s and 50s, mercantilist America has a deep seated fear of the British government, that the British government itself is pouring gasoline on. That is, all those conspiracy theories that the politicians are saying are making Americans even more convinced that the British government is corrupt, ineffective, and out to destroy them. Right? And this fear hits a nerve in America for a number of other reasons that have nothing to do with politics per se. One nerve that it struck was religious. That is, if you were in America in the 1700s, the leadership in America was pretty secular. That is, guys like Thomas Jefferson were people who emerged from the religious divisions of the 15 and 1600s with kind of a cynicism about religion. That is, they saw religion as basically led by a bunch of troublemakers, as by people who just wanted divisions in society, right? And as basically irrational. For example, Thomas Jefferson called himself a Christian, but he said that Christ was the greatest teacher and that all the stories in the Bible that involved things that violated natural law weren't true. Right? So he was a Christian who didn't actually believe in the resurrection or in the miracles. Right? He actually had a Bible printed for himself where he took out all the supernatural references from the original Bible and had it drawn up for him. It's a Library of Congress today. So although the ruling class in America wasn't particularly religious at this time, the common people were. That is, if you were an average person in America, you were far more religious than even the religious people of America are today. And the overwhelmingly dominant religion in America were variations on the Calvinist religions, the teachings of John Calvin. That is, these were hardcore Christians. And Christianity has built within it a deep-seated fear and suspicion of powerful governments. Right? If you know any anti-government people today, or if you are anti-government people, note the correlation between that. That is, how many of them are really religious as well, right? And that comes basically from the history of Judaism and Christianity with government, especially with powerful governments. Judaism comes from the Middle East, and the Middle East has always alternated between having a powerful government dominating the region and the powerful government breaking up and you having a lot of small countries instead. The Jews came from one of those small countries, Israel. Right? So every time a powerful government dominated the Middle East, Israel went away. If you are familiar with Judaism, their starting points for their entire concept of evil begins with the Babylonians conquering Israel, destroying the first temple, and bringing the Jews into slavery in Babylon. Christianity inherits a lot of its ideas from Judaism, so they inherited this suspicion of government too. And the initial history of Judaism and of Christianity and powerful governments was one of conflict. That is, Christianity came up from a world dominated by the Roman Empire, a powerful government that dominated their entire world. The Romans, among other things, they crucified Christ, took the first Pope Peter, and then crucified him upside down. And that eventually, the Christians and the Romans would get over their issues. But the formative experiences of Christianity were experiences that were in conflict with the powerful government around them. So, if you are one of those highly religious Americans of the 1700s, you have within your mind a deep-seated suspicion of government. And let's take a look at that. The slide I put up here is of the book of Revelations, the final book of the Christian Bible. And the book of Revelations is about the end times, about the end of the world. Right? That is, Christ will come back, and then there'll be 1,000 years of peace afterwards. But the bulk of the story in the book of Revelations was about another character. It was about the Antichrist, right? And the Antichrist is going to serve a role in the world. He is going to be the head of a powerful one world government. Right? That is, in Revelations, this charismatic figure emerges and essentially unites the world. Right? And he is a very beloved figure. He runs the world very well. But it turns out it was all a lie. He was just using this in order to lull people into a false sense of security, to set them up for their ultimate destruction. And he was just about to finish this plan when Christ comes back, destroys him, there's 1,000 years of peace. This is a very cynical message about government, right? That is, if you have a powerful government, that this powerful government is plotting to destroy you. And if this powerful government is working well, then that's even more proof that it's a plot to destroy you, right? So if you are a American, an average person sitting around in 1740, 50, okay, 1700 even, you have this deep-seated suspicion of government. And if you were looking for an example of a powerful government, a government that could dominate the world, which nation would you pick? How about Britain? Okay, the country, the powerful nation that runs your country, the powerful nation that's been fighting wars all over Europe and winning them all. Okay, the powerful nation that dominates the seas, right? And if your life under British rule is going well, then it's an even bigger message to you that Britain is plotting to destroy you. Right? So the religious background of Americans, when combined with their political background, when combined with the whole background of mercantilism, are all pointing Americans in the same direction. Be very frightened of the British government, that the British government is out to destroy them. Right? And they're going to become even more afraid of this as you get towards 1750 because of how their mindset is evolving. Right? That is, they are by 1740 and 50 increasingly not going to see themselves as British anymore. They're going to see themselves as something else. Right? They're going to see themselves as something called American. And a key event in this is going to be an event called the Great Awakening. And that is, there are two Great Awakenings. The second one occurred during the 1790s. The first one occurred during the 1730s. The Great Awakening was an attempt by Calvinists to try to reestablish an emotional commitment to religion. That is, where we left off with the Puritans, remember, was England was sick of Puritans by the time you get to the end of the 1600s. And even within New England, the Puritans were starting to lose their religious edge. So during the 1730s, there was an attempt to try to bring this emotional commitment back to Christianity. It was started in England. In England, it was led by a guy named John Wesley. Right? If you're a Methodist, he's the man who founded your church. Wesley sent one of his followers, a guy named George Field, to America in order to spread the message too. And it became called the Great Awakening. It occurred throughout the 1730s. Right? They tried to generate an intense emotional experience for people to get them to connect back with Christ. Right? And these used to be regular events. That is, you would see kind of traveling circuits go throughout the country that would try to create an emotional experience in order to try to bond people, okay, back to religion, back to each other. Right? Nowadays, you don't really see that much anymore, but in kind of the religious world among Christians, this has been replaced by conferences that, as I see a lot of students refer to, instead of having a revival come to them going to a conference, where basically they experience the same thing. It's a very emotional experience designed to kind of revive their commitment, to revive their emotional enthusiasm. Okay. Anyway, so how it worked in the 1730s was charismatic ministers would travel throughout the entire American colonies. All the English-speaking colonies have the Great Awakening going on through them. So these ministers, they would start in one colony and they just keep on going. right? And they centered their message around the concept of the millennium. That is, in Christianity, the millennium is the end of the world. That is, Christ will come back and there'll be 1,000 years of peace afterwards. These revivals were able to generate their emotional enthusiasm by saying that the millennium is not a story. It's not going to happen someday. It is going to happen today. That is, Jesus is at the bus station. He's bought his ticket. He's about to get on the Greyhound. So it means you got to get your soul right, and right now. And that generates a sense of immediacy and generates a sense of emotional commitment. Right? So charismatic ministers were going throughout the colony spreading this message that the end is at hand and you have to get your soul right now. Right? And this message, as it's spreading throughout the 1730s, is going to have two important impacts on American society beyond the religious impacts. One is it's going to unify the nation. Right? It's going to create a deep sense of nationalism about Americans. Right? That is, the American of 1730 was already pretty distant from Britain. That is, they didn't have regular communication with them. If you were living in America, you probably didn't even know anybody in England by the time you get to 1730. Let's kind of look at that a little bit before we go any further. John Smith, when he stepped off the boat in 1607, saw himself as an Englishman in America. The first Puritans who stepped off the boat in 1630 saw themselves as Englishmen in America. They were on a mission to change England. So they would have gone to the dock listening for news from the sailors about England. They'd have closely followed events in England. They would be writing letters back to their relatives in England, to their friends in England. So they would be following very closely what was going on in England. They would be emotionally attached to it. But say you're the son or the daughter of one of those Puritans in 1660. You've never been to England yourself. Your relatives in England, maybe your grandparents, are people you've only known through mail. So you don't have as deep an emotional commitment to them. Okay, you don't go down to the dock when the latest boat from England comes in to find out what's going on. Okay, your emotional connection to England is much more distant. Your kid 30 years later in 1690 is even going to be more distant from England. That is, he probably doesn't even write letters to any relatives in England. He doesn't probably even know who any of them are. Right? She probably has never been there. Okay? So she doesn't really feel anything about Britain. So in 1730, you have peoples throughout the colonies who don't really feel British. Right? What the Great Awakening is going to do is going to make them feel American. Because let's see how this is going to work. Say you're this minister over here. You're going throughout the colonies spreading your message. They don't have Motel 6s yet in America. So if you are from Massachusetts, you go down to Virginia to spread the revival. Where you're going to stay is probably with a local family. So they will house you. And while you're staying with them, you will talk to each other. You'll get to know each other. And you'll find out you have a lot in common. That is, although you're a Massachusettsian and they are Virginians, you've got a lot more in common than you have differences. Right? So when you go on to the next town, you're going to keep in touch. You're going to keep writing letters to each other. And this is going to happen with every town you go to. The net result of this is it's going to serve as a unifying force. That is, all those people who come in contact with each other during their awakening are now going to see that they have a lot in common, that they are not Virginians and Massachusettsians. They are something called an American. Something called an American exists, right? And they are going to identify with being an American. And also, since they write letters to each other, you now have networks of correspondence that are going to hold them together afterwards, right? And these guys also are going to, by going through this experience, generate a sense of immediacy, right? That is, they are spreading a message and hearing a message that that the end is at hand, so you have to get the world right now. This is the message of a risk taker. Right? This is a message that tells you you can't play it safe because there is no tomorrow. If you want to get something done, you have to do it now. Right? That is, if the asteroid was going to hit the plural tomorrow and going to blow up the world, You might as well ask the pretty girl out today, because if she says no, it's not going to be humiliating for very long. Right? So you have a generation going through the Great Awakening who is now unified nationally, who identifies themselves American, and who is motivated to take risks. The people who are going to be most involved in, most caught up emotionally in these revivals are going to be younger people, people in their teens, early 20s. This is going to be the big formative experience of their lives, the one thing they're going to remember more than anything else as they grow older. And these people, this generation, is going to reach their peak of their influence when they get to be in their 40s and 50s, 30 years later. So if you're in your teens and 20s in the 1730s, you're going to be in your 40s and 50s in the 1760s and 1770s, right as the American Revolution is breaking out. That's not a coincidence. Does the generation that came of age during the Great Awakening is going to lead America into the Revolution, because they have identified themselves as American, and they have been brought up to take risks. And what is a bigger risk than fighting a war against the most powerful nation on earth? Right? So, long run, we are building some stuff up. We have a mercantilist society that is afraid of the injustices of mercantilism. British politics is fueling this even more. That is going to make them even more paranoid about the British government. Their religious beliefs are going to make them paranoid about that same government too. These beliefs are being triggered by people who are going around telling them that the end of the world is at hand. And if the end of the world is at hand, what would you be looking for? How about that powerful one world government that's out to crush you? You have a generation that grew up in this religious revival that is motivated to take risks. And you have a generation that now sees themselves as American, which means they don't see themselves as British. And they have a history of what happens to outsiders in their societies. Right? That is, if you are one of those American colonists, you have grown up in a world where people are inside and people are outside. That is, you've grown up in a world that has been divided by race. Right? That is, your people came to America and found American Indians who were already there. They defeated these American Indians and took away their freedom. And what happens to them when they took away their freedom? Those American Indians lost everything. They lost their lives. They lost their land. They even became enslaved. They became the property of other people. Those same American colonists went to Africa. They conquered Africans, took away their freedom. What happened to them when they got conquered? Well, they became properties of the British. Their lives meant nothing. Okay, they had lives of pain and misery afterwards. So, if you are an American colonist, right, you know what happens to people who are on the outside, who are different. Right? They are targets. Your experiences during the Great Awakening told you that you're no longer British. You are something different. So, what do you think the British are going to do to you? And that is, nobody could appreciate freedom more than somebody who's taken it away from someone else. Right? So America's history with race, right, is going to convince them that it is possible that they could be destroyed and have their freedoms taken away from them. So when their leaders are telling them that the British government is plotting to do that, when their religion is telling them that they should be afraid of this powerful British government, right? When they increasingly see themselves as distinct from the British, they assume that the British are seeing the same things about them. And this corrupt British mercantilist government is going to turn on them. What you're seeing is a bunch of things in the long run are leading all in the same direction. It's going to be a fear among the American colonists from top to bottom that the British government is plotting to destroy them. By the time you get to the 1750s and 60s, this is always in the back of the American mind. All they need is something to bring it out to the surface, some trigger, some event that will make them conclude that the British government is not only out to destroy them someday, the British government is out to destroy them today. Right? And if any event like that happens, they will fight a war, if for no other reason, just to have a desperate attempt to save what they already have. And that event is going to occur during the 1750s. It is going to be a war, ironically, that the British won. It is called the French and Indian War. Right? The French and Indian War was one of a series of wars that were fought in Europe. Right? That is, Europe in the 16 and 1700s had a number of powerful nations, and these nations fought in wars against each other. Right? Usually, these wars had two nations on opposite sides, Britain and France. As Britain and France were historic enemies, they were the two most powerful nations in Europe, so they built alliances of nations around them and fought against each other. They had fought several such wars over the 16 and 1700s. And whenever they fought a war, the American colonies got involved in it because the French controlled Canada up here and the British controlled the 13 colonies over here. Right? So those 13 colonies wound up getting caught up in these wars. They'd be raided by French soldiers and Indian allies of the French, whereas they, the British Army, and their Indian allies would raid French colonies. Right? So you'd seen a series of inconclusive wars go on like that throughout the 1700s. In 1754, one more war broke out. It started in America. It started when the Virginia legislature sent a regiment of the Virginia militia to what is present day Ohio, as they had heard reports that the French were building a fort somewhere over here. So this regiment of militia went to check it out. It was led by an obscure colonel named George Washington. Right? Washington led this regiment straight into an ambush. It got shot to pieces. The French, however, let Washington go so he could tell the Virginia legislature to stay out of Ohio. Right? George would eventually get better at fighting. But anyway, the Virginia legislature sent word back to London over what just happened. And this starts a train of events that would lead to another war. Okay? In America, it was called the French and Indian War because the American colonies were fighting the French and their Indian allies. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. Right? And this was a world war. It was fought everywhere. It was fought at sea. It was fought in America. It was fought in the Caribbean. It was fought in Europe. It was fought in Africa. It was fought in India. It was fought in the Far East. And this war different from the previous wars in that this war had a winner. The winner was Britain. That is, the United Kingdom defeated the French everywhere and won a decisive victory. As part of the peace deal that ended the war, the French were forced to give up all their colonies in America. That is, they gave up Canada to British rule and they gave up Louisiana to Spain. They would eventually get it back a few decades later. So, if you're an American colonist, this war basically proved the worth of having the British around. That is, the British military forces were powerful, they could defend you against anybody. And the British had just defeated the main threat to you and your family, that was the French. And this British victory in the war was the first step in the destruction of the British Empire in America. It is going to start a train of events that's going to lead to the American Revolution. Right? And that's kind of ironic. That is, in history, we have something we call the law of unintended consequences. People try to do stuff for reasons, right? And oftentimes they achieve what they set out to do. But in the process, they unleash forces that they didn't anticipate. And those forces could become more important than what they were originally trying to do. So the British fought a war with the French to save the empire. They succeeded. But in doing so, they unleash forces that are going to destroy the empire. Because their victory in the war is going to lead to two problems. These two problems are going to trigger the American paranoia, the American fear that the British government is out to destroy them, and lead Americans to conclude that the British plot is acting now. Right? And so they have to fight to protect themselves. Right? What are these two problems? Well, the first problem has to do with Indians. Okay? That is, they were Native American nations out here, west of the Appalachian Mountains in the 1750s and 60s. They were able to maintain their independence from the Europeans. And how they were able to do this is by playing the British and the French off of each other. If the British became too powerful, they would turn to the French. If the French became too powerful, they would turn to the English. The history books call this area the middle ground because it was in the middle of the British and the French, and also the middle between Indian and European influence. So there'd be a lot of intermixing of cultures, a lot of trade over here. But now it is 1762. The French and Indian War is over. The French are defeated, and the French are increasingly withdrawing from America. Once the French are gone, American settlers are no longer afraid to go into this area because they don't think the French are going to arm Indians to destroy them. So by 1762, you see American settlers pouring into these lands, what is going to become present day Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, okay, Western Pennsylvania. The Indians here are terrified because every time American settlers come into their lands, they wind up losing those lands. They didn't land on Plymouth Rock, Plymouth Rock landed on them. So the Indians of this area organized themselves to try to stop the American settlers. They were organized by a Shawnee war chief named Pontiac. Right? And what followed next was a term on your list, okay, Pontiac's Rebellion. That is, Pontiac organized a coalition of Native American nation to fight against the American colonists, to drive them out. The British were forced to send in troops in order to stop them, right? And the British government won this war. But they reached a very important conclusion from this. That is, they had just fought a long, expensive war against the French. The last thing they wanted afterwards was a long, expensive war against the Indians. And they knew if American settlers ever went into Indian lands, they were going to have to wind up going in and trying to protect them. Right? So the British government was looking for a practical way to solve this conflict. Now, what they came up with was one of the terms on your list. That was the Proclamation of 1763. As the British government in 1763 drew this line across America. It corresponds to the tops of the Appalachian Mountains. It said that no Indian was allowed east of that line, and that no American was allowed west of that line. The areas west were reserved for Indians. And in order to make sure that both sides stayed on their side of the line, the British government would send 10,000 soldiers to patrol the border, to be a peacekeeping force. For the British government, this was a practical solution to the problem, a way to keep the peace, a way to prevent war. The American colonists has a plot to destroy them. Why would they see it that way? Well, to start off with, the British government just sent 10,000 soldiers to America. You're an American colonist, you would ask yourself, why does America need 10,000 soldiers? Because after all, the French are gone. You don't have to defend against anything. It doesn't take much of a stretch for paranoid people to believe that those 10,000 soldiers don't have their guns pointed in this direction. Those 10,000 soldiers have their guns pointed in this direction. Because remember, going back a little bit, these Americans were terrified of a military. They thought that militaries were there to destroy the liberties of people. Right? This was a fear that went from top to bottom. So they see this new British military that is here as a plot to destroy them. This British military presence is justifying its existence by saying it is there to protect the Indians. If you're an American colonist, you think that's ridiculous. That is, the only thing you do with Indians is kill them and take away their land. And while they're at it, the British government is telling you can't do that anymore. Why are they doing that? You figure the British government doesn't give a rat's ass about Indians any more than you do. So why you assume they're doing it is that this is part of the plot against you. Let's walk through their reasoning. If you're an American colonist in 1763, you're a small farmer. That's what keeps you free. You own your own land, and you can produce on that land what you need to survive. But in order to make a farm work, you need about 50 acres of land or so. There's plenty of land around here to go around. But the average American settler has 8 to 10 children. Each of those children is going to need land. So sooner or later, you're going to wind up filling up this entire area. So what do you need if those children are going to have the same opportunities that you did? You're going to need more land. What did the British government just say in the proclamation of 1763 that you can't have? They said you can't have all this land over here. They said that you can't have this land because it's going to be reserved for Indians, which you think of as ridiculous. So why are the British government telling you you can't have this land? Well, you start to conclude it's because the British government doesn't want your children to have land at all. That is, they want your children or grandchildren to become like poor people in England, as essentially landless people who are going to be forced to work for rich people. That is, this line here, this keeping you from getting all this land is part of a plot to destroy you. So, what the British government sees as a practical measure to keep the peace to prevent war is going to be seen by paranoid Americans as a plot to destroy them, as a way to keep a military in America to destroy them, and as a way to prevent future generations from getting land in order to destroy them. The British government had no such plot, but that didn't matter because the American colonists believed that they did, right? So the British success in the French and Indian War is going to lead a trail of events, okay, that is going to make the Americans more paranoid. And neither side really understands the other. The British government does not understand why preventing the Americans from going west is terrifying. They don't understand why having troops patrolling the border is terrifying the American public. And the American public does not understand, okay, what the British are up to there. That is, these two sides are getting farther and farther apart. And the American paranoia is one of the things that's going to be driving them apart, right? So the British success in the war is going to create problems about Indians, about land. And it's also going to create problems about money because wars are expensive. The French and Indian War cost the British government, we estimate, 125% of their gross domestic product, right? If you put that into today's dollars, the United States today has a gross domestic product of $20 trillion. So 125% of that would be $25 trillion. That is the kind of money that the British government spent to fight the French and Indian War. They came up with all this money by borrowing it. So now that the war is over, they have to pay the money back. So if you're government, you have to come up with money to pay back your debts. How do you come up with that kind of money? You start taxing people. Hey, and who are you going to tax? Well, how about taxing the people who got the most benefit from the war? Right? There's the people whose security was now insured because of your victory. And how about taxing the people who paid the lowest taxes in the empire, who coincidentally are the same people, right? Which would be the American colonists. Because remember, the American colonists laid less taxes than the people who lived in England. They got more benefit from the war than the people who lived on the British home islands. So why not make them pay the taxes to pay for the war? Okay? If you're the British government, this seems only fair. And if the American colonists don't like it, well, they should sacrifice their selfish interests for the best interest of the country. The whole idea of mercantilism. Right? So throughout the 1760s and 1770s, the British government started imposing taxes on America. The Americans are going to see these taxes as a plot to destroy them. Right? And let us go into why. Right? The first major British tax that got passed was something called the Stamp Act. Right? The Stamp Act was a tax on paper products. It said that any paper product had to have a tax paid on it, and the proof that the tax was paid would be a stamp. Right? So, say you're a newspaper editor, you want to publish a newspaper. You would have to go down to your tax office and buy a bunch of tax stamps. You would put a tax stamp on your newspaper that showed you paid the stamp, then you could distribute it. If you were a lawyer, your legal documents would be on paper. So if you would file those legal documents, you would first have to go down to your tax office, buy some tax stamps. You would put a stamp on your legal document, then you could file it. If you want to buy a deck of cards, A deck of cards are made out of paper. So the guy who printed those cards would first have to go down and buy tax stamps for each deck of cards. He would have to put one on one of the cards, and then it could be sold. Right? The British government saw this as a practical solution to the problem, as a way to tax the people who were taxed the least in order and benefited most from the war in order to come up with the money to pay off the war debt. This is how the Americans saw the Stamp Act. They saw it as a plot to destroy them. Why would they look at it this way? Well, let's see who was in America. And let's start with the rich. Right? America had a minority of people who were wealthy. These were the big slave owners in the South. These were the merchants in New England. These were the large fishermen and farmers who sold to the Caribbean. If you're an American rich guy, you don't want to pay taxes, partially because you don't want money coming out of your pocket, but also because of just kind of the message that it sends. Remember, in mercantilism, the rich and powerful dominated the government. They used it for their own benefit. So whenever they passed taxes or things like that, they exempted themselves. So if you're a rich guy in America and the British Parliament is imposing taxes on you, this is more than them taking away your money. This is the British government telling you that they think you're one of the little people. That is, they don't look at an American rich person as an equal to a British rich person. Right? They look at you as weak. Right? Because if you weren't weak, they wouldn't tax you at all. So if you're an American rich guy and you let them tax you, then this is you basically telling the British leadership that you're a punk. Right? That is, that they will keep coming after you for more and more and more and more and more. That's how mercantilism worked. So the American rich guys tried to organize the colonists in order to oppose the Stamp Act. And in future taxes, they would do the same thing. And by the way, the Stamp Act, the British picked a particularly unfortunate group of people to tax. They picked people who use paper. Who use paper? Lawyers use paper. Ministers use paper. Newspapermen use paper. Teachers use paper. That is, they taxed the people who led the colonies, the people who were in a position to organize opposition. So these guys went to the common people in America and told the common people that these British taxes were a plot to destroy them. The vast majority of Americans at this time, white Americans, were middle-class farmers. These were farmers who owned their own land. By owning their own land, they could live a comfortable existence. They could produce plenty of food, come up with the resources they needed to survive. But they really didn't make much money. That is, if you were a middle-class farmer, you lived in a pretty isolated land. That was the difference between the land of you and the land of the rich people. Your land had quality. It was as good as the land the rich people had. But the rich guy lived on land that would be close to a river, close to the ocean. So anything he grew could be transported elsewhere. If you were middle class, you lived on land that was far away from transportation, right? So anything that you would grow, you would wind up consuming yourself. So these middle class American farmers, although they lived comfortable lives, were people who really didn't have a whole lot of currency. What do you have to pay taxes in? That is, the British government is not going to accept chickens as payment for taxes. They're going to want their taxes paid in cold, hard cash. And if you don't have cold, hard cash, what happens to you? Well, the government forecloses your land, sells it at auction, and then uses the proceeds in order to pay off your delinquent tax bill. Right? So it doesn't take much convincing to tell the middle class American that that was the whole purpose of the tax. That those taxes weren't there to raise money. Those taxes were there to destroy them, to take away their land and reduce them into slavery. Remember, their leaders had been telling them that the British government was planning to do this for 100 years. And this is all the stories about Robert Walpole. This is bringing out all of their deep-seated religious fears about powerful governments. And it is bringing up the racial history, the idea that if you are not one of the rulers, then you're somebody who's going to get crushed. This is bringing in all their fears of the injustices of mercantilism. So when a handful of rich peoples try to organize opposition, say that the tax is a plot of the British government to destroy them, to enslave the people, middle class America is on board with this. Right? So you now have the vast majority of the American public united in kind of hysterical opposition to the taxes. Then we get to what the final group in America. These are going to be poor people. About 20% of the white population were people who did not own land, who did not have money. These were people who were going to live in the towns, be day laborers, who were going to be tenant farmers. Especially they're going to be concentrated in New England. These guys didn't have to pay taxes because they didn't have any money. And they didn't have any land to lose. So you figure they wouldn't be too concerned about these British taxes. Except they found that rich people would come up to them and tell them things like, we're going to be holding a protest against the British taxes. Here's a nice shiny coin. Join the protest and throw a rock against an English soldier. That is, they found a financial incentive in taking part in riots against the British government to oppose British taxes or any other British policy. Right? If any of you have any relatives who fought in Iraq or in Afghanistan, you probably ran into the same thing. That is, a lot of the people that were shooting at them, if they ever caught them and interrogated them, they would find out they were just random people who had somebody come up with them with an AK and a $20 bill, said, go shoot at an American. That is, they didn't have any deeper commitment to the issue than that. Right? So poor people can get caught up in the protests as a way to make a living. And they find when they get caught up in the protest that they're no longer treated like poor people. That is, people without land were treated basically like scum. They were called the vulgar herd. But now, if you are taking part of the protests against the British government, you are now a patriot. You are now a citizen. You're now somebody who gets some respect. And you find that as the protests go on, the British keep sending more and more soldiers into America, and you have more and more friction with them, which gets you more and more involved in the protests. So the next thing the British government knows, it's 1764, they have American colonies as one big happy family, united in opposition to their taxes, okay, into the Stamp Act. There are riots all over America against the Stamp Act. The British government doesn't understand why. So what they did was they repealed the Stamp Act, but they passed something called the Declaratory Act, which said they had a right to tax the American colonies. And they replaced the Stamp Act with other taxes because they figured they need the money to pay out the war debt. That is, all of their thinking was still in effect. The Americans were mad at this tax. Well, we'll give them another tax and they'll be okay with that one. So in 1767, the British government passed a set of laws called the Townshend Duties. The Townshend Duties weren't taxes on paper, they were taxes on trade goods. And they saw the same process unfurl. For example, the wealthiest man in America was a guy named John Hancock. He was a guy who owned a ship, he traded in commodities. Like every other rich guy in America, he ducked the taxes on it. That is, he avoided all the taxes that the British government had on trading goods around the world. And so now that the Townshend Duties were here, he didn't want to pay them either, for all the reasons that we talked about. He didn't want money coming out of his pocket. He didn't want to send a message of weakness to the British government. So he started to organize opposition to the taxes. Once again, middle-class farmers hopped on the bandwagon because any tax on anything was something they saw as a threat to their land. And poor people also got caught up in these taxes. In 1769, a set of rioters, protesting against the Townshend Duties, started throwing rocks at a bunch of English soldiers. These poor people by 1769 were very angry with the British Army because the British Army, among other things, was, in order to put down the protests, was becoming a bigger and bigger presence in Boston. Boston had 16,000 people in it in 1769. It had 4,000 British soldiers there in 1769 too, in order to keep them under control. The British government, remember, didn't want to pay to house these soldiers, so they passed a quartering act and forced poor people to house them in their own houses. Right? which made the poor people very mad at those soldiers. Also, the British government didn't like to pay those soldiers. So they would go out and get second jobs like shoveling snow, shoveling coal. That is, they were taking away jobs from poor people. So the poor people, through financial interest, through anger at the British soldiers, from contact with them, through patriotism, wound up getting really carried away with these protests. They would just pick up rocks, cobblestones, whatever they could get, and just pelt the British army with them. In 1769, one group of British soldiers lost their head and fired one volley of shots into the mob that was throwing rocks at them. This is something the history books call the Boston Massacre. 5 American protesters wound up getting killed in it, right? And once again, the British government doesn't understand why this occurred, right? That is, they see themselves putting in a tax that seems reasonable to them, and they don't understand why the Americans are so mad at it. The Americans, on the other hand, don't understand the British thinking behind the taxes. They just see a tax as a plot to destroy them, right? So you get another American set of taxes to the Townsend duties. You get another hysterical reaction in America, and you get another event where neither side really understands the other. The British government responds to the American protests over the Townsend duties by repealing all of them, except for one, and that was a tax on tea. They didn't repeal the tax on tea because a big British joint stock company called the British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Right? And remember, if they went bankrupt, all their investors would lose everything they had, including a lot of rich guys who were members of the British Parliament. In order to save the British East India Company, they decided to give them an exclusive monopoly on the sale of tea in America and throughout the British Empire. Right? They figured the Americans would be okay with this because the British East India Company would charge for tea less than the price that tea was selling for in America in the first place. Right? So the American colonists would get cheaper tea, the East India Company would stay afloat, and all of its investors, the rich guys in the British government, would get to keep all their money. Right? Mercantilism at work. And if the American colonists didn't like it, well, they should sacrifice their selfish interests for the best interest of the country. So the British government saw this as a win-win situation for everybody. The American colonists saw it as a plot to destroy them. This is their thinking. They said the British government is doing this to destroy American merchants by selling cheaper tea. Right? And once they destroy the American merchants, then they would turn on the American farmers, everyone else in America, and reduce everyone in America into slavery. Right? That is, the deep-seated fear of the British government is being triggered more and more by events. And now their conspiracy ideas are going more and more outlandish. How do the Americans respond? Well, they attack an British East India Company ship in Boston Harbor, throw the tea into the harbor, the Boston Tea Party. By now, the British government is fed up. They think the Americans are a bunch of selfish idiots, right, who are just childish. They want all the benefit to British government. They don't want to pay the taxes in order to support it. So they figured we've been soft on the Americans long enough. Now we got to punish them. So they passed a set of laws that shut down, among other things, the port of Boston and dismissed the American legislators that were complaining about the taxes. The Americans called these the Intolerable Acts. They led to more protests. The British government reacted by cracking down harder. And by 1775, this leads to a shooting war. Right? So we want to put it all together. Why was there an American Revolution? Well, in the long run, the American Revolution was caused by a combination of mercantilism and paranoia. That is, the mercantilist system was going to generate a lot of things that are going to eventually lead to American concerns about the British government. And these are going to be aggravated by a sense of paranoia that is going to be built up by the British political system, by American religious beliefs, by American kind of racial history. okay, so on and so forth. And once this paranoia is put into place, once mercantilism and paranoia made the American public afraid of the British government, short-term actions that were done as a consequence of the British problems of the French and Indian War. Okay, their actions of putting in taxes to pay to pay off the war debt, their actions in order to limit conflict with the Indians are going to convince the American colonists that the plot to destroy them is now in effect. And that is going to lead to a trail of events that leads to the American Revolution. And that war is what we're going to cover in your next set of classes. Right? So I will put that one up in probably a couple of days.